The horn that signaled assembly rolled across the training basin like a low wave and seemed to shake moisture from the leaves. Heat hung over Calf 7 in lucid sheets that made distant tree lines sway in place, and the red clay underfoot bled a mineral smell that hinted at rain long before any cloud arrived. Ray Parker jogged to the muster grid with a pack that barely rustled, boots whispering on the packed surface, eyes already scanning above the heads of the arriving cadets. She did not look at the crates stacked along the edge of the field, those shining aluminum reliquaries that comforted students who trusted metal more than sense. She watched the canopy instead. The broad leaves of the crown creepers showed their undersides to the wind in pale flashes, and that told her more than any weather feed would have told her. A storm would not simply arrive. It would test seams, test patience, and test anyone foolish enough to mistake weight for strength. Rows formed with the chime of hand comps. Mixed squads of Arc logicists and Namar amphibians, of Karg basalt skins and Zalari refractors, stood shoulder to shoulder in the moist heat. As always, the lines looked clean and the faces looked anxious. The announcement was brief, delivered by a senior instructor who liked to let silence carry the threat. He listed the parameters with the cadence of a judge. 1 hour until the heat index peaked and needle rain bands began to march across the basin, 2 hours of sustained storm activity, 3 hours of post-event saturation with high runoff and unstable footing. Shelters had to be habitable by the 30-minute mark. Failure forfeited the entire field assessment. Ray felt the ripple that moved through the squad when the last requirement dropped. Only materials harvested within a 200-meter radius would count toward bonus points for field ingenuity. Half the heads turned toward the crates anyway. Habit pulled at hands the way gravity pulled at rain. The first lids popped with the hungry clack of impatient fingers. Modular frames slid out in silvery ribs, and anchor plates thudded into mud that had already begun to soften toward paste. Ray did not step forward. She took 1 pace back, then 3 steps to the left, and lifted her head to feel the minute threads of the wind. Air drifted along the slope in thin rivers that moved faster just above knee height, then slowed where buttress roots threw miniature eddies into the flow. She watched how small tag leaves trembled on their petioles. She watched how the pale sporangia on the creeper vines closed when air passed dry over them and opened when air carried wet. She let that tiny theater write a map on her skin. The heat pushed at her like a hand. That pressure would climb and then release, and when it released, the storm's first edge would be near. To her right, a cluster of Arc cadets measured angle plates and argued about surface area versus load in a tight spiral of fast speech. Across the grid, a line of Karg pounded posts in by brute rhythm, heavy bodies making a drum line on the clay. The Zalari refractors unpacked translucent panels that shimmered like held water, and for a moment the field glittered as if covered by a thin lake. Ray watched the panels and noted how light passed through them and came out milky. The panels would turn into ovens when the air stilled. The Namar erected a tubular frame with a practiced economy that she admired. The joints snapped with a satisfying click, and the membrane snapped with a drumhead pop. That shelter would be the first to bead, then sweat, then drip. The amphibians would tolerate heat longer than some, but the membrane would pull condensation into a rain of its own. She made the assessment and put it away without pleasure. She respected skill even when the solution fought the place. She set her hands on her pack straps and counted her breath without thinking about breathing. 4 in, 6 out, then a stretched 8 that cooled her chest more than the shade could. She lifted her eyes beyond the training basin to the hem of rock that held the stand of broadleaf creepers in a fringe. The leaves lay like scaled plates, each with a glossy top and a matte underside lined with veins. When wind ran under those plates, the entire crown breathed. She could use that. The hollow reeds along the runnels shivered with a higher, quicker rhythm that belonged to another layer of air, the thin layer that slid just above the ground and hugged every contour before it bled into the thicker flow. She walked toward the reeds to see how roots bit into the clay. The clay at this elevation ran a little more orange than the deeper red at basin center. Orange meant less iron and a touch more sand, which meant faster drainage if she cut the trench shallow and gave the water something smooth to follow. She knelt and pinched a ribbon of clay between finger and thumb, rolled it into a worm, and bent it until it cracked. The crack talked to her the way a broken twig talks to a tracker. It told her how much water the clay already held and how much more it could drink before it moved from plastic to slick. The horn blew again, a shorter blast that meant the exercise had begun. Ray did not rush. She stood with her back to the field so that her hearing could file away the different sounds that would later help her judge how far each squad had progressed without turning her head. She listened for the dull thunk of anchors set too shallow. She listened for the harsh squeal that meant a bolt fought a plate in a way that would tear later. She listened for the increasing hiss that began when the first fingers of the needle rain wrote confusion over the leaves. The storm had not arrived. The storm had started to talk. She stepped toward the creepers and felt the first pressure wave comb her hair back. She lifted a leaf and turned it in her hands, measuring the length against her forearm, measuring the flex with a slow bend that almost let it break. The plant objected with a faint squeak against her skin. She apologized under her breath, not as a superstition, but as a reminder to herself that everything she touched would shape what touched her in return. She chose her build site the way a fox chooses a den, not where it would be obvious, not where it would be dramatic, but where the land already held a small advantage. Two buttress roots formed a shallow V that pointed down slope, with a natural hollow at the apex where water would want to loiter before it followed the slope. She traced the edge of the hollow with a finger and imagined the trench that would drink that water and carry it away down a line that would not cut back into the foundation. She marked a ridge line in her head that ran perpendicular to the dominant wind, not because she wanted to fight it, but because she wanted to harness what that wind would do when it met a low intake and a high release. The lesson had lived in her long before she put a name to it. When she was a child, she had watched steam walk along a kitchen ceiling until a cracked window drew it into a thin, steady river that left the rest of the room clear. She had learned later to say pressure gradient, but the first lesson had been a finger following a thread in the air. She slid the pack off one shoulder and took out a coil of cordage, the light kind that bit into itself and held a knot with quiet confidence. She would need it for a ridgepole. The pole in her head already had a home between the two roots, at a height that would let a person crawl inside without fuss and sit without hunching into pain. She set the coil beside her foot and moved to the runnel where reeds grew in tight ranks. She did not cut the first stand. She walked another 10 paces and cut the second so that regrowth would have the better shot where water ran first. Her knife made a soft note, and the reeds came away with clean ends that would not split when lashed. She laid them along the root with the same care a mason lays the first run of stone, because an easy mistake at the start demanded heroics at the end, and she did not plan to be a hero. She planned to be finished before panic felt useful to anyone. Across the basin, the Namar shelter creaked as the membrane tightened. The Zalari frame glittered and then dimmed as moisture filmed its surface. The Karg hammered another anchor, and the sound rang wrong, a deeper thud that meant mud had softened more than expected. An anchor would walk later when the wind pulled. She kept that in the column of useful knowledge and did not spend any thought on the satisfaction that tugged at the corners of unkind smiles in other faces. The Ark debated airflow coefficients and shook heads at the idea of a vent that lost heat by definition. Ray brushed clay off her palms. Heat would be the enemy for the next hour. After that, water would be the enemy. After that, gravity would be the enemy as the whole basin tried to move downhill. She planned for all three enemies with the same tools: angles, patience, and the ability to let the place teach her how it preferred to be lived in. When the first pinprick needles fell, she felt the sting on her forearms where sweat amplified the sensation. The needles did not puncture skin, not yet. They woke nerves and smudged confidence. She pulled her sleeves down and looked up through the moving lattice of leaves, not for comfort, but for confirmation. The pale undersides showed more often now, flipping with little panic gestures that mirrored the growing gusts. The air shifted and came from the southeast, which meant the intake would need to sit low on the northwest face, with a vent that opened under the eave on the southeast to let the invisible hand that pressed on the back of the shelter pull air through rather than push it in. She rubbed clay between her fingers again and felt grit where before she had felt smoothness. Surface water had begun to lift fines and leave a thin silt along the top, and that meant the trench would need a skin of stone for the first meter to keep the inlet from collapsing into a slurp of gray. She crouched and ran a fingertip along the line where the trench would start, then stood and tested the strength of a nearby creeper vine. It gave with a slow, springy objection that felt perfect for a gutter once it sat against a slope. The vine would want to twist under weight. She would tame that with 2 lash points and a small saddle stone. She smiled without showing teeth when the plan clicked into place with the last small detail that had annoyed her in the background. She thought of the other teams and wished them good fortune without pretending to herself that fortune would matter more than a willingness to unlearn pride. She had heard the word primitive spoken like an insult on this field more times than she could count. She did not hate the word. She hated how a student used it to end a thought instead of start one. The rain thickened by a fraction that only counted as a number after a person taught fingers to count in another language. The leaves played a faster counterpoint. Somewhere a bolt pinged into mud and disappeared forever, and a voice cursed in a way that belonged to no species in particular. Ray tied a quick loop into the cordage, then loosened it and tied another, bored with speed that had no strength behind it. When she set a knot on a line that would keep a roof above a head in a storm, she wanted it to pull tight under tension and loosen when hands asked politely. A knot had to be honest. She ran the line once between the roots and pulled with her weight until the cord sang. The pitch told her how much more the line would take before it bit into bark. She eased the tension, shifted the bite point, and pulled again until the same pitch came back friendlier. The field officer's voice crackled through the basin again with the final reminder, 30 minutes to habitable. She did not look at the countdown on her wrist. A number like that turned a mind into a horse that only saw a fence and the fall beyond it. She carried the reeds to the root-formed doorway and laid them parallel to the ridge line in tidy bundles that would later become spars and a little dignity inside a space small enough to turn panic into a thing that sat outside in the rain. She placed the first leaf against the root and ran a palm over the glossy surface to feel the micro-ridges that would decide whether water walked down the length or tried to pool at the seam. She pressed the clay between 2 leaves and pulled them apart to see how the film stretched and how it held. She did the same thing a second time because the first time told a person what she hoped to see and the second time told a person what she would get. When she straightened, the field had changed character. The carg line worked faster now that the surface had softened, hammers traveling in shorter arcs to spare arms from the sucking rhythm of mud. The arc-logicists had moved from argument to assembly and had given breath to relief that came too early to deserve respect. The Zalari panels held shape and sweated light, a trick of optics that fooled the eye into thinking a roof invited coolness. The Namar had split into 2 teams, one to keep tension even along the frame and one to dig a gutter with webbed hands that knew water better than most. Ray felt affection for that choice. She pivoted slowly and looked down the slope to trace the line that runoff would cut when the first sheet of water escaped the brush and found relief in movement. That line crossed her imagined trench at the right angle. She adjusted the trench line in her head by a hand's breadth to make sure the crossing would be a conversation and not a collision. Another needle found the back of her neck and delivered the message that the appetizer had ended. The storm would now sit and eat as long as the table held. Ray slid a hand along the cord to test tension and nodded once. She set the knife aside where her knee would not find it later, and rolled her shoulders to ask muscles to wake and work without complaint. She filled her lungs, let the air go, and let her mind step into the narrow hallway she used when a job had to be done, while the weather tried to unteach lessons she trusted. She heard a laugh behind her when an ARC cadet noticed that she had not opened a crate. She let the sound pass through her like wind passes through the canopy when the canopy knows how to flex. She remembered a river at home that taught her that a person who meets force with force breaks where a person who meets force with angles holds shape. She bent to the work, not because the horn told her to move, but because the leaves and the clay had finally given her permission. She set the first lash without haste, because a rushed knot failed when a storm leaned on it. The cord slid warm under her fingers as she wrapped the ridgeline around the left buttress root and brought it back in a snug turn that crossed itself like a tidy stitch. She loaded the turn with her weight, felt it seat into bark, and finished with a friction hitch that would tighten under pull yet release when she asked. The second lash mirrored the first on the right root, the same number of wraps, the same measured pull, until the line hummed at a pitch she trusted. She laid a length of reed across that line to test deflection and saw the bow match what she had in mind. Slight, not slack, ready to shed water rather than hold it. She cut a springy stalk for the ridge pole and nested it against the cord so that cord and pole shared the load. 2 quick bindings married pole to line, and the skeleton of the shelter existed, a single clean intent held between roots that had weathered more storms than any cadet. She moved to roofing without glancing at the field. Leaves waited in a neat stack at knee height, glossy surfaces beaded with the first hints of moisture. She flipped the first shingle so the matte underside faced inward and set it at the leeward edge. Clay pressed between palm and thumb spread into a thin, continuous film that bridged veins without clogging them. She overlapped the next leaf by a third, set another clay bead with a quick roll, and smoothed the seam until her hand felt no ridge that would catch a drop and coax it sideways. Row by row, she worked from the bottom up so that higher shingles always covered lower seams, just as fish scales made a river slide off skin. Her hands learned the rhythm in a handful of minutes. Press, smooth, overlap, check. The ridgeline accepted the growing weight without complaint. Where a leaf tried to curl away from obedience, she pinned it with a split reed peg that she drove through a friendly vein rather than across it, because a cut that respected grain held, while a cut that fought grain tore. She left an intentional gap low on the windward side, no larger than her hand, and set a short hood above it, angled to catch moving air and bend it inward without inviting rain to follow. The high vent sat opposite, under the leeward eave, a narrow slot that would never show from the outside unless a person knew where to look. Between those 2 openings, the interior would breathe like a pair of lungs with a calm pulse. She did not need to test it yet. The air itself had not yet become heavy enough to force the issue. That would come when the sky pressed down. She shaped that future now while breath came easy. The trench came next. She cut the first line with a wedge of broken slate she had palmed earlier, a tool so simple that a child would have dismissed it until she showed what an edge and a plan could do together. She skimmed the surface rather than gouged, knowing that smooth channels moved water faster than raw scratches that invited eddies. The trench ran from the shallow hollow at the root V and curved away in a lazy S that refused straight lines on purpose, because a straight cut would invite water to attack banks. In the first meter, she laid smooth stones plucked from the runnel's lip, setting each like a tooth with its crown toward the flow. When she poured a palmful of water from a reed tube at the inlet, it ran with relief and made no sound except a polite hush as it turned the first bend. She lined the trench mouth with a small sill, a flat leaf pressed to clay, that would keep the first surge from eating the lip. The gesture took seconds and would save minutes later when minutes would matter again. She glanced once at her hands and saw the map the work had drawn there, clay ghosting her knuckles, a fine grit embedded in the creases of her fingers, a narrow green bruise where a leaf had fought and lost. She rubbed her palms on her trousers, not to polish herself, but to reset texture for the next job. She braided 2 creeper vines into a flexible gutter and saddled it against the ridge line on the windward side, directly above the trench head, so that any water that tried to run along the underside of the roof edge would meet the vine and accept escort to the ground. She cut a short reed, split it, and formed a spout with the split turned downward into the gutter. A reed ring bound the spout into a deliberate mouth. The assembly looked humble. Function did not ask for decoration today. Interior sparring happened without fuss. She took 6 reeds, trimmed them to the same length by habit, and lashed 3 pairs together into shallow arches with 2 wrap bindings that held without crushing. Those arches set under the ridge, not to bear load, but to offer an interior frame for sleeping and to keep her head from knocking the roof when she sat. A floor mat appeared under her hands from split reeds laced into a rectangle large enough for one body to lie down without learning every stone by name. She set that mat 3 fingers above ground on low pegs so that air could pass and moisture could not loiter. When she pressed the mat with a knee, it flexed and then held, quiet as a promise she felt comfortable making. Heat ratcheted up a notch as the first wide breath of the storm went through the canopy and pressed humid weight into the basin. The needle rain thickened into a prickle that laid itself against skin and made light sting. She paused, not to admire anything but to feel movement. Air nosed at the low intake and then retreated like a cautious animal. A moment later, a steadier push arrived, and the high vent whispered so softly that a person would need her cheek almost to the seam to hear it. She tore a scrap from a dead flower head and let it go near the intake. The scrap slid inward, lifted, and disappeared into shadow. She felt the faintest smile find her mouth. The lungs had begun to breathe. Clay sealed the last long seam across the ridge. She kneaded a handful until it turned slick and responsive, then laid a thin coil and flattened it with the heel of her hand, so texture became continuous from leaf to leaf. She knew that clay would crack if she pretended heat did not exist. She scored microchannels with a thumbnail so that the film could move without breaking. Where the ridge pole touched the line, she smoothed a small saddle of clay so that water would not wick along cord fibers. She learned that trick in a rain on a mountain that spoke in granite instead of red earth. Lessons traveled well when a person bothered to pack them. She stepped inside on hands and knees and sat. Light filtered green through the leaf skin. Heat felt present, but not aggressive. She drew a slow breath and watched her own exhale rise toward the vent without lingering. She set the reed canister by the wall near the trench head, where the spout would feed it once the rain thickened enough to make collection meaningful. The canister had a clay lining she had smeared earlier, a simple coat that would keep taste honest and grit out of mouthfuls. She pressed a thumb to the lining and lifted it away. The smear held. Good enough for a drill, and better than a person deserved if that person laughed at leaves and clay. Only then did she let the field return to her ears. A carg hammer went silent, replaced by a series of low curses that said an anchor had decided to walk. An arc frame clicked with frantic speed, the tempo of someone who had realized that debate had been a luxury. A Namar crew sang to keep timing even while rope stretched under water weight. The Zalari panels sang a different note, a thin resonance that happened when membranes started to bow in ways a designer did not intend. She did not gloat. A lesson made sharper by another's pain felt cheap in her mouth. She looked once toward the grid. An instructor stood beneath an awning with a hand comp raised, making quiet notes, face impassive, eyes restless. She used the last of the first coil of cord to add 2 storm ties across the roof at thirds, not to crush the leafwork, but to discourage lift. She did not cinch them hard. A roof that could flex would live. A roof that fought wind too earnestly would rip itself apart to prove a point no one needed. She tucked loose ends under bindings with the careful fingers of someone who had been trapped by her own untidy work once and did not intend to repeat that embarrassment. She checked all four corners by habit, even though a shelter that nested between roots had no corners to fail. Habit had saved more lives than inspiration ever would. Water came properly then, a sound like sand poured over silk, the needles unspooling into tight curtains that moved sideways before they moved down. The gutter caught the first run like a polite server, transferred it to the spout, and offered it to the trench with no drama. A few drops tested seams, and the seams turned them away. A sheet of water gathered on the windward face, tried to climb against gravity along a vein, and lost interest when the clay film spread the force too thin to matter. She watched for a full breath, then another, and then decided the roof had told her what she needed to know. She slid back outside and made herself small under the eave to check the leeward seam. The high vent breathed sweet, a quiet draw that skimmed heat and scent from the interior without inviting rain to write its name inside. She meant to bring the floor from acceptable to good. She took 3 more reeds, split them, and wove a small matte lip at the threshold so that feet would brush before entering and leave grit behind. She set a short rail just inside, a place to tuck a wet jacket and keep it above skin. Sweat ran down her temple and tasted of salt and iron. She wiped it away with the back of her wrist and let the water become part of the weather that the shelter would handle without complaint. She allowed herself 1 measurement, not with a device, but with her own count. She lifted her hand comp, not to worship the number, but to record the time as a datum she could later teach with. She had no ritual for numbers. She had respect. The screen gave her a digits answer that matched the feeling in her bones. She pocketed the comp and surveyed the immediate perimeter. The trench mouth would need a little tooth at the lip if the sheet flow thickened. She pressed 2 flat stones into the upstream side to make a miniature weir that would calm the first slap of water and guide the rest into the curve. She checked the gutter lashings and nudged 1 binding so the spout sat perfectly over the trench, not a whisper off-center. The adjustment felt like closing a door to weather and opening a door to sleep. She stepped back into the basin's rhythm and heard confusion in clusters that had promised certainty an hour earlier. A metal frame rattled in protest as a gust got under an edge and treated the structure like a kite. A shout for ballast followed. Sandbags went on too late and in the wrong place. A ridge beam bent. A second shout, lower and more honest, admitted that the beam would not forgive insult. She looked away and granted privacy to the lesson. A Namar cadet glanced across the distance and saw her roof shedding water in a quiet veil. The cadet's eyes widened and then settled into a thoughtful narrowness that belonged to someone who could learn in real time. Ray lifted her chin by a fraction, not as a challenge, not as a boast, but as a greeting from one practical mind to another. She ducked back inside and closed the intake hood by a finger's width because the gust had freshened. Airflow shifted to a slightly stronger pull, the high vent eager to do the heavy work now that pressure had gone up. She placed the reed canister under the spout where the first clear trickle would find it after the gutter flushed dust. She ran a palm along the interior seam again, feeling for the small betrayals that only skin would detect. The skin felt a continuous plane. Her mind checked a box that meant she could leave the roof's care to the roof. When she crawled out the second time, she did nothing grand. She wiped her hands. She collected the offcuts and tucked them out of foot traffic. She coiled the remaining cord with the same care she had used when hunger had made her shiver on a mountain, and neatness had turned into calories saved. She looked at the shelter from 3 steps away, from 7, and from 12, because perspective changed truth. From 12, it looked unimportant. Good. Unimportant meant exactly right for a field where storms preferred to talk to big ideas first. The horn that marked milestones did not care whom it startled. It sent a flat note over wet leaves and metal and skin. She felt the sound as a small vibration in her sternum and let the meaning arrive a breath later. She did not pump a fist. She did not raise her voice. She touched the ridgepole once with the backs of her fingers, a superstition she would deny if anyone asked, and then she set her knee on the mat and sat inside the green light, listening to the vent whisper. On the field, someone announced a number with disbelief, and a laugh that sounded like surrender learned the pleasant way. She glanced once at her hand comp to make sure her sense matched the record. The screen confirmed what her body already knew. 12 minutes had passed from first lash to last adjustment, and the shelter had begun to do what it had been invited to do: breathe, shed, endure. Heat arrived like a second skin and pressed against the green light inside the hut until the leaf walls seemed to ripple, yet the air kept moving in a soft, steady draw that erased the worst of the weight. Ray adjusted the low hood by a thumb's width and felt the pull deepen, the high vent answering with a quiet thread of sound that kept her nerves level. She watched a thin streamer of dry seed fluff that she had pinned near the intake. The tuft leaned inward and trembled just enough to show that the gradient held. The reed canister under the spout had already swallowed its first clean mouthful after the gutter flushed dust, a small victory that mattered because it happened without ceremony. She placed 2 fingers against the clay seam at her shoulder and felt the surface cool where moisture met moving air. Skin made a better instrument than any wand when she wanted to know whether a house breathed or only pretended to breathe. Outside, the basin began to shine with the kind of glare that made edges disappear. Metal ribs flashed and then dulled as membranes stretched. A Karg squad leader barked once, and a younger Karg answered with a grunt that held more stubbornness than confidence. An arc frame clicked through a series of tidy snaps that would have impressed an engineer in a clean room and now sounded out of place in a field that preferred persuasion over force. The Zalari shelter held the eye for the wrong reason. The panels looked like water and behaved like glass. Light pooled inside and did not leave. Ray could not see faces through the milky veil, yet she knew what that kind of heat did to breath and patience. She set her palm on the floor mat and pressed. Resilient tension answered, no wet creep beneath. She allowed herself 1 number, checked her hand comp without fuss, and logged a crude differential. Inside air sat several degrees cooler with a lower humidity spike than the basin average. She would use the number later when someone asked for proof, and for once meant it. A shadow fell across the intake and moved back in a way that respected another person's house. A Namar cadet crouched at the threshold, cheeks sheened, gills at her neck fluttering in tiny protests that she tried to hide out of pride. She had webbing at her thumbs that made rope work elegant and heat management harder. Heavier air had started to punish her, and she would not admit it until her hands shook. Ray tipped her head, an invitation to speak. "May I sit one moment?" the Namar asked. Her voice carried a river's burr. "I will not track mud." Ray raised a palm toward the mat lip and moved it in a small circle to show the brushing habit she liked. The cadet obeyed, slid inside on knees, and stopped halfway through the motion of a breath as the vent took the exhale away from her face. Surprise softened the lines at her mouth. She closed her eyes once, opened them, and laughed low like a stream over stones. "Sula," she said by way of a name. "Icon works the gutter in our camp. He thinks he knows water." She touched the mat with careful fingertips, as if to apologize to it, and then sat back against an interior spar. Ray gave her a reed shard and a smear of clay without explanation. Sula understood the language and sealed a seam corner by instinct. Useful hands learned quickly when comfort gave them space. "Why here and not higher?" Sula asked. She tapped the low intake with the back of a knuckle. Ray pointed to the red clay outside. "Coolest air sits close to the ground when the sun pushes. Here, the intake kisses that layer, then sweeps across damp clay. The roof pulls because the wind presses on the far side. Pressure does the work for free if the angles invite it." Sula watched the vents whisper as if she could see it. "You make a river through a house," Sula said. The word pleased her mouth. Ray nodded. "A slow one. Fast water tears a bank. Fast air does the same to a seam. She rapped the ridgeline lightly with her knuckles and listened for the answer. The line sang at the same friendly pitch as before. Clay cooled her knuckles. The sound put her in a place where arithmetic felt like a story that could be told without numbers in a pinch. Noise in the field thickened from irritation to concern. An ARC cadet stepped out of a metal shell and peeled a membrane flap with a hiss. The flap released steam that had nowhere to go. He paused, wiped his forehead, and looked back at the rig with an expression that admitted that the design had not lied so much as told a truth in the wrong language. He saw Ray's hut and adjusted his stance to pretend he had not seen it. A Zalari technician, small, limbs refracting light in angles that made her look like a bundle of thin prisms, took 2 steps out of the shining tent and sat. She had chosen her structure for elegance and speed, and now paid for it. Ray reached into the doorway, lifted the canister, took 1 swallow for confirmation, and walked the rest to the Zalari without turning the moment into a rescue. "Clay lining," Ray said, and tipped the rim. "No grit." The Zalari accepted the offer, drank with the concentration of someone unfamiliar with thirst, and handed the canister back with both hands as if it were a tool, not a gift. "Carrie," she said softly, "your roof refuses light in a way I did not expect." She looked toward Sula, noticed the gills, and tilted her head in a brief gesture of respect between strangers. Ray returned to the doorway, set the canister under the spout, and heard the clear note of water that had learned its path. Sula had not wasted the minute. She placed her cheek near the high vent and tried to measure the pull with skin the way Ray had. She lacked the practice and relied on her ears. "It is kinder than a fan," she decided. "A fan lies. This does not lie." She raised her face toward the roof angle and frowned at a tiny ripple where a leaf wanted to cup rain. Ray slid inside, pressed the heel of her hand against the ripple, and smoothed clay along the vein until the surface turned from a bowl to a ramp. "Roof angle carries insult away," she said. "If a drop can choose to gather or walk, make it choose to walk." Sula nodded and reached for the reed shard again to repeat the move and set the motion in her muscles. An instructor drifted closer as if she had obeyed a current. She kept to the awning's edge, hand comp raised, face composed into the bland mask the Academy preferred for fairness. She aimed the sensor past Ray's shoulder, recorded a sweep, aimed toward the arc shell, and recorded another, her expression unchanged. "Document your design in 3 sentences," she said. Ray could have talked for an hour and made everyone sleep. She picked blunt words instead. "Low intake to a damp clay path, high vent under the leeward eave. Shingles overlapped with a capillary film so drops cannot climb. Trench shaped smooth to carry the water that arrives after the insults." The instructor did not blink at insults. She wrote 3 symbols that meant nothing to anyone but her and moved away without praise or censure. Ray did not miss the microsecond longer her comp had stared at the hut. Sula let a small breath out through her teeth, a noise that said that markers had been placed in an invisible ledger and would not be erased easily. Heat tried a last bluff before the storm's proper edge would arrive. The basin shimmered a fraction, and the sound in the Zalari panel changed from hum to uneasy moan. Condensation bulged and fell inside that bright tent in a mimicry of rain that baptized no one. Carrie tightened her jaw and began to cut a vent into a seam with a hand that watched a tradition abandon her and forgave it anyway. A Karg student, wide shoulders, stone dust at his elbows, stood and then sat when the ground stole the decision away. Ray saw him shake his head to clear a wave of heat and put his hands on his knees until breath remembered how to work. She set her mouth in a line that meant she would not interfere unless asked. An ARC squad lead, Merritt, a woman who turned every sentence into a question that she did not intend to answer herself, walked past Ray's hut with the glance of someone who had known for 3 minutes that her plan would need grace from a stranger and had not yet decided how to ask. Pride made practical minds slow. Ray did not hold that against her. She had been slow herself once, with mud up to her shins, and a man on a ridge yelling advice in the wrong key. Sula stood and bowed her head inside the tiny room, because the place deserved that much from a guest who had used it to teach her blood how to move again. "May I bring Ikan?" she asked. "He insists that a membrane can be taught to be a reed." "He needs to sit where air holds him without hands." Ray lifted her chin. "Bring him. He will leave when he understands what the house asks." Sula smiled, the expression brief and honest, and slid out into glare with a grace that made a reed jealous. She returned with a tall Neymar who had forearms like braided rope and a habit of breathing that had turned ragged in the last hour. He ducked, brushed his feet the way Sula had, and sat with his hands open on his knees as if he had been arrested by comfort. "He hears the vent," Sula said, amused. "He thinks a river is a song." Ikan nodded at the intake, then at the trench mouth. "You tell the rain where to go, and it obeys because you speak its language," he said. He touched the mat with 2 fingers and looked up with grateful irritation at himself. "I will copy this," he said. Ray did not soften the next sentence because kindness had to live with bluntness when time ran tight. "Copy the angles, not the parts," she said. "Your home will not have these leaves. Your home will still need to breathe." Noise shifted again in the field. A second horn marked a midpoint and woke a dozen mistakes that had been trying to hide. A membrane panel snapped where a seam had been cut in a hurry. 2 hands grabbed a flap that bounced and flapped harder in answer because wind loved an argument. The Neymar crew sang louder and found a new rhythm that matched weight to frame. Carrie cut a second vent and laughed once at the absurdity of finding the right design by breaking the wrong one. Merritt finally stopped moving as if motion could outrun the sun and stood at the edge of Ray's clearing. "I want to see," she said. The admission cost her, but she paid exact change. Ray slid aside and let the ARC officer crouch by the intake. Merritt frowned at the small opening. "I calculated losses," she murmured. "Losses are not losses if the flow changes state," Ray said. Merritt blinked, mind adjusting gears. "You invite a phase change to carry heat away," she summarized. "You made a swamp trick wear a jacket." The phrasing made Sula snort with genuine delight. "You have a poet's insult," Sula said. "Keep it. It will help you build." Merritt flushed and nodded once, chastened but teachable. Ray stepped outside to stand under the eave and ran the back of her hand along the exterior to feel for hidden heat pockets. The leaf skin offered tiny differentials that she read like Braille. She pressed 2 fingers against a place where a shingle overlapped too generously, thinned the clay margin with a clean pull, and watched a test drop travel in the direction she wanted instead of placing a challenge where none was needed. She looked up through a break in the canopy and saw the sky flatten from blue to white in a slow shift that would end in a gray sheet. Afternoon had reached the part of the day that sounded like a held breath. She tightened the gutter lash by a finger bone, checked the spout alignment with a miser's satisfaction, and turned back to the doorway. Inside, the air had moved a half-degree closer to comfortable because the storm's outer ring had begun to push hard enough to make the vent ambitious. Ikan had his eyes half closed in the expression of a person who listened to a machine behave right for the first time. Merritt crawled in with a dignity that argued with the posture and failed to win. Ray pointed at the ridge line with her chin. "Touch it," she said. "Listen." Merritt did, and the line sang the same answer it had given Ray. "It speaks in a steady pitch," Merritt said. "That means load has not shifted." She looked as if she wanted to ask the line not to betray her in front of students she had taught. Ray gave her the mercy of another practical sentence. "If it darkens by a tone, step outside. You will have a breath before the cord asks for help. That breath is a gift. Use it." Sula found the reed shard and drew a quick diagram on a scrap of bark, leaf angles, intake and vent, gutter mouth and trench curve. Ray nodded at the drawing. It had room to be wrong and still be right. "Roof angle," Ray said, and rested a straight reed across the doorway at the same slope as the shingle run. Imagine a drop in love with the roof. Give it no reason to stay. She let a bead of canister water fall from a knuckle. The bead kissed the reed, hesitated as desire always does, then walked away because gravity and a smooth path offered a better story. Ekan watched with exaggerated solemnity and then grinned like a boy. "He will sing that to Rope," Sula said. "He will say Rope is a drop and show it where to go." Ekan made a face to object to the word boy and did not push the complaint because comfort had improved his manners. The instructor returned once more, hand comp quiet this time, mouth against a radio that transmitted only numbers. She knelt at the threshold and extended one finger inside without stepping over. "Show me your coolest point," she said. Ray tapped the clay just inside the intake where damp met fast air and smiled when the instructor's eyes widened by a fraction that an untrained face would miss. "Some of you will fail this drill," the instructor said without malice. "Some of you will fail and keep the lesson. Those are not the same outcomes." She stood, spoke into her radio again, and moved on. The afternoon settled into a tense truce. Metal shelters functioned like kilns that had learned a little humility. The Zalari tent stopped lying to its inhabitants after Carrie cut philosophy into it in the form of holes. The Karg learned to wedge anchors with flat stones to spread force. Merritt borrowed Sula and Ekan for 10 minutes, and under the shelter of Ray's Eve, admitted that a membrane that trapped heat had a duty to stop pretending to be clever. She returned to her frame with red clay under her nails and a bundle of leaves tucked under one arm like a contraband idea. She would not copy a hut. She would borrow angles, and that would be enough for now. Ray sat inside and drank a second measured swallow. She let the vent take her exhale. She placed her hand on the ridge again and felt the same sure note. She did nothing empty with her face. She ran a final check on seams with the care of someone who knew that smugness often traveled under the same skin as satisfaction and carried knives. Outside, the light dimmed by one step as the sky traded shine for intention. The test had passed the point where heat taught. The next chapter would belong to water and weight. She rolled her shoulders, slid the knife into its sheath, and touched the mat with fingertips that had learned this field's grammar well enough to speak without an accent. The hut breathed. The basin gathered itself. She drew one last easy breath and wrote a short list in her head of moves that would matter when the storm turned rude. Wind arrived on a low growl and stiffened the canopy until the broad leaves turned their pale undersides like shields. The needle rain that had tickled skin thickened into slanting curtains that hissed as they met clay and reeds. Ray felt the change cross her scalp the way a barometer changes a room. The vent drew harder, the intake nosed at the damp edge with more confidence, and heat stepped back to make room for pressure. She slid out from the green light and stood under the eave with her palms braced to either buttress root, while the first real gust tested every chosen angle. The roof flexed exactly as she had asked it to flex, and the gutter accepted work without complaining about the pace. The trench whispered in a new voice. The first true sheet of water found the curve and followed it as if it had always intended to go that way. She answered the storm with more skin on the work. Clay would hold better under a smooth coat than a thin film, so she rolled a fresh handful, kneaded grit into submission, and pulled a second skin over the windward shingles. The coat did not need to be heavy, it needed to be continuous. She smoothed each run with the heel of her hand until droplets lost interest in pooling and chose to walk. Where a leaf had started to lift on a stubborn vein, she set a split reed pin through the friendly line and pressed a thumb to the clay until the surface answered with a clean slope. Sula arrived with a bundle of leaves tucked against her side, hair dark with rain and eyes bright with concentration. Ekan carried a coil of creeper vine that he had braided tight enough to make a line that would not twist under load. Ray took one look and pointed to the leeward edge. "Cross ties at thirds," she said, and Sula had the cord around the ribs before the gust could argue with the plan. Icon set a low bowline around the buttress root and ran the free end across the roof with a smooth throw that landed true on the far peg. He worked with the grace of someone who had spent a decade reading rivers. The second salvo of rain hit with a sharper hiss. Acidity prickled at nose and tongue, mild enough to ignore today, unkind enough to punish lazy seams. The gutter filled, shouldered the run into the reed spout, and the trench took a faster breath. Ray knelt at the mouth and pressed 3 flat stones into the bed to armor the lip. Water patted the stones and slid on without chewing into the bank. She moved a handful of clay at the sill with a potter's calm and then straightened to scan the basin. The metallic shelters no longer pretended to be wise. A membrane snapped on a rising edge and turned a neat rectangle into a wild tongue that beat on its own supports. A set of anchors began to walk in step with the wind. The Zalari shelter had stopped humming in misery. Carrie had cut dignity into it with vents and now watched beads run along the seams like a scientist who had found an unexpected friend. A shout rolled across the rain, not the theatrical kind, the kind that carried the small panic of a structure that had begun to fold. Ray saw the source at once. On the far edge of the grid, Merritt's pod had lifted a fraction at one corner. The frame had not failed yet, but the oscillation hardened into a rhythm that would tear something expensive if it ran another minute unchecked. Ray did not permit herself a debate about whose lesson this belonged to. She pointed to the vine in Icon's hands and raised her chin toward the failing pod. He understood without ceremony and sprinted low across the open clay, head down, jaw set to keep rain from disabling judgment. Sula tucked a bundle of leaves under her arm and went with him, because a brace without a skin would only move the fight from one edge to another. Carrie left her tent with a ring of small stones cupped in the bowl of a membrane offcut and followed at a measured pace that kept the stones in place. Ray snatched a reed as thick as her wrist from the runnel's edge, trimmed the ends with 2 clean cuts, and set off behind them in a straight line that dodged standing water by instinct. Merritt stood inside the pod with one hand braced against a rib and the other arm held out to keep a younger Ark from stepping under a bending beam. The upward corner lifted again, higher this time, and the pod creaked at a pitch that spoke of metal learning an ugly song. Ray slid under the leeward edge where wind could not steal her words. "Compression here," she said, and set the reed between a crossmember and the ground at a clean angle so force would travel into clay instead of into a reluctant joint. "Guy to the root behind," she said to Icon, and he had the line around a buttress before the sentence ended. "Cross stay over the crown," she said to Sula, and Sula ran the vine across the roof and cinched it with a hitch that bit only when the gust bit. Ray set her shoulder to the reed and pushed until the bow relaxed by a thumb's breadth. The frame sighed as the oscillation lost its confidence. Carrie stepped in without touching anyone and laid 3 stones under the reed foot so the compression point would not chew into mud. Merritt blew out a slow breath, put both hands on the bow, and held until the next gust admitted defeat. She did not thank anyone with words that would waste oxygen. She met Ray's eyes and nodded once in the way of a peer who had earned the right to look blunt gratitude in the face. The basin learned in a quarter hour what lectures had failed to teach in a month. Lines went up at better angles. Leaves found their way onto metal that had no business pretending to be skin. Gutter mouths appeared over trench heads that had been simple ditches an hour earlier. Ray moved from one small disaster to the next without staying long enough to become indispensable. She tuned a rope by a half-turn, paired a clay run with a single stroke, altered a roof slope by a reed's thickness, and let crews own the rest. At one station, a Karg student, heavy-shouldered and ash at the elbows, knelt to wedge a flat stone under an anchor plate. He looked up once to measure his guess against her face. She tipped her head to grant him the courtesy of a correct instinct, and kept walking. The ridgeline at her hut held a true note when she checked it at a run. She adjusted the intake hood by 2 finger widths and felt the interior pull change from eager to disciplined. The canister had collected enough clear water to make a small luxury possible, so she rinsed grit from her lips and let a measured swallow sit at the back of her tongue until her mouth cooled enough to remember language without a fight. The sky had turned from white to a wet gray that pressed down without promise of lightning. No thunder would speak for an hour. Wind had all the words today. A sharp report cracked from the far end of the basin. A membrane seam had let go on a hard edge, and the flapping panel now threatened to become a sail. Merritt's voice cut through the noise with an instruction so crisp that even a panicked hand could obey it. Sula and Icon were already moving that way, but Ray did not need to follow. She saw that the crew had learned angles already. She turned instead toward a low camp where two students worked in silence, one Neymar woman with her hair braided back so cleanly that rain ran off without grabbing, and one Karg boy whose jaw clenched whenever his hands shook. Their roof shed well, but the trench tried to run backward after the second bend. She put her fingers into the clay and lifted the lip of the outer bank by a thumb, then pressed the inner bank down with two flat stones. Water obeyed the new geometry with the sudden grace of a dancer who had been taught the right step. Another gust arrived in a long, low push that felt personal. Ray rode it with her knees bent and her hands spread and let it spend itself against a roof that knew how to bow without surrendering. She looked up and watched the canopy give back what it had been forced to take. The leaf plates flipped and righted, as if the whole crown practiced yielding rather than breaking. She smoothed the clay skin again where beads tried to argue with her slope and wiped her hands on her trousers to renew grip for the next move. Dusk arrived as a slow dimming rather than a switch. The basin shifted color from green to slate. In that light, the leaf roofs became gentle shadows, and the metal shelters became awkward sculptures that tried too hard. Ray made one more circuit. At Merritt's pod, the reed strut still held, and the guy line sang a lower note that meant load had settled. Merritt had added a leaf skin to the windward face, a humble veil that calmed eddies that had spent an hour inventing trouble. Carey had cut two more vents with a surgeon's neatness, and the interior no longer glowed with trapped heat. Sula had taught two ARC students to lash a cross tie without strangling the roof, and Icon had built a gutter from a membrane offcut with reed ribs that looked as if the material had meant to be that shape. The mixed work did not look like a single school. It looked like a field that had remembered it could teach. Ray returned to her doorway and added a second shingle layer to the windward half of the roof, offset from the first by half a leaf. The coat made the roof heavier in a way that mattered for honesty, but not for lift. She brushed the intake lip to refresh the clay and ran a finger along the vent to ensure the narrow slot had stayed narrow. She pressed the mat with her palm. The platform gave a fraction and held. She set the canister in the corner where a knuckle of root would keep it from wandering if the ground shook under a hard gust. She drew a short breath and let it out long, not to calm herself. Calm had stayed, because a field deserved that respect from a person who had asked it to hold so much. One last cry reached her from the near line. A small pod had buckled a rib and bent toward a young cadet who had frozen under a flapping panel that threatened to bite. Ray did not think about dignity. She moved. She slid under the lip, caught the panel with the flat of her forearm, and shoved the bite back into a place where it could do less harm. "Not here," she said to the boy, and guided his shaking hands into a hitch that turned panic into leverage. "Brace here," she said to the girl who knelt with a line still coiled in her fist, and guided the coil into a pull that found the right angle on the first try. The rib stiffened, the flap lost its argument, and the pod decided to live another hour. The boy blinked twice, and then nodded with his mouth knotted into a line that promised he would forgive himself later. Ray pressed his shoulder once and stepped out without letting relief make her lazy. Night took the basin slowly. The canopy taught itself a different song at lower wind and higher water weight. Drips acquired rhythm. The trench along her hut made a steady hush that could have been a lullaby in another life. Small lights glowed under leaf eaves where students had set lumens behind clay to keep glare off wet eyes. Ray counted roof angles with her gaze as she walked the last perimeter check. She noted 6 leaf skins on metal pods that had not expected to need them and now depended on them without shame. She counted 3 gutters that would not have existed if pride had stayed in charge. She measured the way air moved through her hut with the back of her hand and saw that the vent had not choked even under the extra coat. She closed the intake a finger's width more for night and set a reed peg across the doorway at shin height to keep sleepy feet honest. She sat at last. The green light had turned a darker olive. The vent whispered more softly and more steadily than it had at noon. Sula's laugh came muffled through rain from the next clearing and resolved into a low song that Ekin had matched with a rhythm on a reed tube. Merritt's voice carried a sequence of short sentences that had finally understood the size of a request and had made peace with it. Carrie hummed something that had no scale and made a stone sound warmer. The storm did not end. It kept its promise to press. The basin did not break. It kept its promise to learn. Ray rested her hands on her knees and felt clay dry at the knuckles in a thin, harmless crust. She thought about what the morning would ask and what the inspection would measure. The numbers would be kind to the work, but she had no interest in kindness from numbers. She preferred the proof that had already arrived: air that moved the right way without a fan, water that ran along curves without chewing, lines that sang the same note at dusk that they had sung at noon. She let exhaustion stand near her shoulder without letting it sit. She listened once more to the vent and to the rain, then tipped her head back and closed her eyes long enough to let a lesson settle. When the storm turned rude, the field had not asked for heroics. It had asked for angles, patience, and hands willing to make small, honest moves in the right order. Morning did not arrive as light so much as a loosening of pressure. The storm's hand lifted a fraction, and the canopy answered with a soft uncoiling that sounded like relief. Ray woke to the same steady whisper at the high vent and the same calm note in the ridge line when she tapped it with the backs of her fingers. The leaf skins smelled clean, green, and faintly mineral where wet clay had given up heat all night. She slid a palm along the seam above her shoulder and felt no new betrayal in the surface. The trench murmured at a lower pitch, a sign that the main sheet had already passed and left orderly runnels in its wake. She eased the intake hood open by a finger so dawn air could arrive without shock, then stepped out under the eave into a world washed to a hard clarity that made every mistake honest and every good choice obvious. The basin wore the storm like a second skin that had been shed and laid neatly aside. Leaf roofs held beads that broke and ran at the first curious touch. Metal frames showed streaks and scars that would become notes in a maintenance log. Mud had settled into a fine skin over everything, and footprints wrote last night's learning in a script so plain that no one needed an interpreter. She began with repair that would not wait for a horn. The trench mouth had gathered a shallow fan of silt where the first heavy push had dragged fines along the bed. She slid a flat stone through the fan to re-establish the good curve and pressed 2 small teeth into the lip so the next storm would hesitate in the right place. The gutter lash stood true, yet one binding had swallowed enough water to soften its bite, so she lifted a turn, let it breathe, and set it back down with a firmer hand. The second shingle layer on the windward run had seeded overnight into the coat beneath, and a thumb pressed along the seam told her the clay had cured into a skin that would move without flaking. She pulled the reed canister into the light, checked the clarity, and took 3 small swallows that tasted faintly of leaf and stone, an honest taste that made the whole morning feel right in her mouth. Voices moved at the edge of hearing, low, tired, normal. Sula appeared first, hair braided tight, face marked with the tired satisfaction of a person who had learned well and then taught well. She lifted a palm in greeting and crouched to inspect the trench with the proprietary air of a craftsperson evaluating another craftsperson's line. "He slept," Sula said, and jerked her chin toward the neighboring camp where Ekin rolled a coil of damp vine with the tenderness of a musician putting away a favorite instrument. She sang until he forgot the membrane, Sula added, tipping her head toward Carrie's tent, where the Zalari technician stood with a hand against a new vent, eyes half closed in the pleasure of a solved problem. Merritt arrived with 2 ARC students in quiet tow, no bluster left, only a clipped efficiency that fit morning better than afternoon pride. The instructor came behind them with a compact scanner in one hand and a slate stylus in the other, boots leaving narrow, precise marks that stepped between prints as if she could not bear to smudge a record she intended to read. The inspection began without ceremony. The instructor held the scanner inside Ray's doorway for a patient 10 count, while Lucy-colored light painted a tiny bar across the screen. She noted the interior temperature and humidity, then moved the wand to the intake seam and the high vent, recording the gradient with the calm of a doctor who had seen every wound before and still cared. She ran the wand along the windward roof and caught a little sigh as the clay skin shed the last cool of night under the sun's first firm look. She knelt at the trench head and dropped a measured cup of water from a graduated tube to watch the curve take it without fuss. Capillarity kept the seams honest, the instructor said in a voice that had no intention of praising anyone and still managed to respect good work. Intake and vent built a stable draw, no measurable ingress. Time to assembly? Ray gave the number without flourish. Merritt's mouth tightened and then loosened in a private acknowledgement of a clock that had punished a different choice. The instructor logged the time and moved on with the same even pace. The circuit around the basin wrote a quiet story of revision. Metal pods breathed now that vents had learned humility. Leaf skins lay over windward faces where calculations had failed to anticipate the shape of insult. Gutters built from membrane offcuts and reed ribs carried water with an eagerness that had surprised students who had been taught that only a factory could make function. Anchors sat broader on stones that carg hands had wedged under plates, with the care usually reserved for setting hearthstones at home. The inspector's scanner tallied each interior and exterior metric with the same patient appetite, and the ledger accumulated proof without drama. When she returned to Ray's clearing, she did not announce results from on high. She lifted her slate and spoke as if she read a recipe. This hut holds the lowest interior temperature during peak heat by 5 degrees. Night humidity sat 2 points under basin average with a stable differential across the sleep period. Water ingress recorded 0. Assembly time met the first milestone at 12 minutes. Structural note: no tonal shift in the ridgeline under gust. Ancillary note: gutter and trench combination prevented base erosion. She paused and then looked up, and the almost smile that touched the corner of her mouth belonged to a person who had seen 100 shelters and was pleased to admit surprise on the 101st. Document the build. 2 pages. No rhetoric. The Academy will test a standard module based on this pattern next cycle. Name it if you want. If you do not want, I will assign a dull name and the work will still stand. Ray nodded, not out of false modesty, not out of shyness, but because the work had already written its argument into mud and leaf and cooled air. She glanced toward Merritt and met the other woman's gaze squarely. Merritt took one clean breath and stepped closer to the doorway. I was wrong about loss, Merritt said in a tone that made an apology sound like a theorem. I treated venting as surrender. I forgot that surrender to a pressure gradient is not the same as surrender to heat. I will teach the difference. She extended a hand, palm open, not for a handshake, but in a small, precise gesture of offering. If you write the 2 pages, I would like to add a third that describes hybridization with aluminum ribs. I will not put my name above yours, Ray accepted with a slight incline of her head. Write your page, she said. Bring Aiken and Sula to write theirs. I want the gutter to be described by a Neymar hand. I want the cross tie to be described by the person who sang it into being. Carrie arrived at the threshold and touched the leaf skin with the tips of 3 crystalline fingers. I will write about light, she said, amusement soft in her voice. I made a temple to glare yesterday. I will not do that again. I will show how to let a roof glow without trapping fire in a bottle. Ikan stepped behind her and leaned his shoulder against the buttress root, the posture of a person who had been awake most of the night and did not resent the fact. I will draw the mouth of the gutter, he said. A river learns a shape faster when the shape makes a song. Sula will tell me when my lines lie. Sula laughed once in agreement and crouched to run a finger along the trench lip, already framing sentences in her head. The instructor recorded names with the stylus and flipped the slate closed with a gesture so tidy that it felt like punctuation at the end of a long paragraph. Inspection continues for 30 minutes, she said. After that, drills conclude. Students will strike shelters, remediate sites, and report to debrief with notes and revisions. She hesitated one heartbeat and then added, The Academy will adopt paired modules for next term. One metal kit, one biomaterial build. Teams will alternate lead on deployment. No student will pass without competence in both languages. She did not look at Merritt as she said it. She did not need to. Ray set to writing before any of the adrenaline that had sustained the night could curdle into story. She trimmed a sheet of bark to a clean rectangle with the knife and smoothed clay across one face to make a surface that would accept the stylus, then wrote in a hand that had taught children and argued with engineers and managed to keep both audiences awake. She described the site choice first. Windward and leeward identified by leaves, slope mapped with eyes and knees, hollow noted as opportunity rather than threat. She described the ridgeline next, lash mirrored on both routes, pitch confirmed by deflection under a test read, tone established with a knuckle. She described the roof in 3 sentences and a drawing, overlap by a third, film thin enough to move, pins through friendly veins, never across. She wrote the intake and vent like an equation anyone could solve. Low kiss of cool air, high whisper out, pressure gradient allowed to do what it had wanted to do from the start. She wrote the trench and gutter as a duet. Stone teeth at the lip, curve refused straight line arrogance, spout married to the ridge with a reed ring that did not lie. She wrote maintenance in 12 words. Touch seams with skin, listen to lines, nudge, never pry. Merritt leaned over the page when Ray gestured and filled the margin with a precise addendum that translated angles into ratios and pointed out the load paths that a student would need to understand if the leaf skin ended up married to an aluminum rib. Carrie drew a small panel in profile, showed where a membrane could invite light and reject heat with a tiny change of texture, and labeled the drawing with a Zalari glyph that had no human equivalent and still made sense. Sula added a sketched plan of the trench head with a Neymar symbol for hush, explaining that a quiet mouth never chewed. Ikan traced the gutter mouth and wrote a single sentence about the spout's downward turn that read like a proverb. The horn called end of drill, and the field obeyed. Students who had walked the line between panic and patience all night now worked with a competence that daylight made easier to see. Leaves came down in reverse order and stayed whole because hands had learned not to fight veins. Cordage came down in coils that would be usable next time because fingers had decided that neatness was nutrition. Membranes folded without drama because vents had removed the urge to explode. Anchors came up with flat stones still under them, and a few Carg students left those stones in place as a gift to the field rather than a stash for a future theft. Ray struck the hut with an attention that refused to erase what it had learned. She loosened hitches clean, pulled pins without tearing, and stacked leaves in a neat pile to be returned to the runnel's edge so rot would become soil rather than trash. She raked the trench flat and placed the stone teeth along the bank where they would make a home for moss. She brushed the clay skin from the roots with a soft reed so bark could breathe, then stood back until the clearing looked as if a careful animal had passed, built a den for a single night, and left without a debt. Sula carried the reed mat to the runnel for washing, humming while she worked, the tune a steady rhythm that had set rope under weight the night before. Ikan slung the gutter over his shoulder to carry to Merritt's camp, where a class would cut and stitch a dozen more. Carrie tucked her bark sketch into a waterproof sleeve and touched the eave once with her fingertips. "This roof taught me to be kind," she said. "I do not know why that sentence feels correct." It does. The debrief gathered under a canopy of woven membrane with a scatter of leaf skins that turned the harsh noon into a soft green. The instructor did not stand on a platform. She stood on the same ground as everyone else and spoke to the basin rather than to ranks. She outlined metrics first, because facts deserved the front of the room. She highlighted failures as if she introduced old friends who had changed names and wanted to be known properly. She called 3 students forward to describe revisions in their own words and asked for numbers after each so virtue could be measured and not just admired. Merritt took her turn without flinching, explained her error with the same care she used to explain a proof, then described the hybrid with a seriousness that made the room settle into a focused quiet. Sula spoke next and made hydrology gentle without making it foolish. Econ honored rope and river with a short talk that would live as a remembered joke in dorms and as a remembered law in storms. Carrie ended with light, and her crystalline fingers drew in the air until even a carg boy in the back who hated math leaned forward to see how a surface could reject a lie. When the instructor called Ray, she did not ask for a speech. She held up the bark and clay and said, "This will be filed as Field Standard CAFE 7 Biovent Shelter, Provisional Designation Parker Pattern. Margin pages will carry hybrid notes by Merritt, gutter by Eichen and Sula, light control by Carey. For next term, paired drills will be mandatory. One team will lead with metal, the other with biomaterials, and then teams will swap roles. Failure in either language will be failure in the course. This is not a punishment. This is fluency. Dismissed after remediation. Parker, deliver the original. You may keep a copy." The room exhaled as one system and then began to move in a purposeful scatter that meant the lesson had taken root in muscles as well as in minds. Ray walked the bark to the instructor and passed it over with clean hands. The instructor slid it into a sleeve and then into a flat case with the same care she would have given a living thing. "I could assign a dull name," the instructor said, mouth tilting again. "You did not choose one." Ray looked at the field and at the root V that had held her line and at the trench that had turned hunger into patience. "Call it something students will not roll eyes at," she said. "Call it the leaf lung and write the ratio under it so no one can pretend it is magic." The instructor nodded once. "Leaf lung, Parker pattern, ratios included. Done the basin thinned of people. Mud dried into spiderweb cracks that began to blow to nothing under a light wind. The canopy regained its glossy calm." Ray coiled the last line, slid her knife into its sheath, and stood with her thumbs hooked under her pack straps for a long moment while she let the field finish talking. The smell of wet stone and green resin and clean air in motion would go with her whether she wanted it or not. She did not test the ridge line again. She did not need to. She touched the buttress root with the backs of her fingers the way she had the ridge that morning, a private thanks to structure and to patience. Sula came to her side and bumped her shoulder with an easy, sisterly nudge. "He will brag," Sula said, meaning Econ. "I will allow it for one day." Carrie lifted a hand in farewell from the edge of her camp and turned to teach a smaller Zalari how to cut a vent without angering a membrane. Merritt raised 2 fingers in a spare salute that had lost all its old sharpness and gained something weightier. "Next drill, I will ask you to cripple my pod on purpose," Merritt called. "I want to prove we can rescue it in 10 breaths." Ray nodded. "We will fail once in practice so no one fails in the field," she answered. By evening, the only sign that a storm had passed and a lesson had been learned was a faint clay ghost on 2 roots and a series of small, neat piles of leaves waiting to become soil. News outran feet. In the meal line, a pair of first years retold the day as if it had been a fable, and the number slipped into the story the way a river number slips into a boatman's song. "She finished in 12 minutes with leaves and mud," one student said to another with a grin that had no malice in it. The second student rolled the number on his tongue and nodded as if he had always known it. Ray heard the words and did not bristle. She accepted the phrase for what it was, a simple way for minds to carry a blueprint. She knew that the part of the story that mattered would not fit in a single sentence anyway. The part that mattered had already taken root in hands that would, in a season or in a year, set a line at the right pitch, cut a vent that breathed without a fan, and build a gutter that sang the right song in the first hour of a storm. When she finally put her head down, she did not replay the night as heroism. She filed it as proof that a person who listened hard enough could turn a field into a tutor and a storm into a patient examiner. The academy would put a dull code under the leaf lung and stamp it into a catalog. Students would copy the pattern in classrooms and in mud. Some would sneer at the lack of hardware. Some would sneak out to try it on a weekend and discover that the pattern did not care about belief. She closed her eyes, let the hum of the dorm's air system become a faint, polite version of the vent's whisper, and let sleep find her without argument. In the morning, another horn would call another drill in another basin with different leaves and different clay. She would go because angles and patience traveled as well as any kit, and because a person who had let a roof breathe once had no interest in teaching silence.